Hi, I'm Ken Ito, the Director of the Center for Japanese Studies. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to our new lecture today. Our new lecture series is drawing to a close. There's one more lecture next week by Ian Miller of Harvard University. So for those of you who have been regular attendees at our new lecture, thank you very much for joining us. Let me invite you to join us again for the winter series, which begins on January 27th. There's a list of the winter talks on the table as you go out, the green sheet. So please help yourself to one and join us for as many talks as you can. Today's new lecture will be given by Professor Laura Hein of Northwestern University, who's recently published a book from CJS Publications on the topic of our talk today. This is the book Imagination Without Borders. This book will be available for purchase at a discounted price after the talk. So for those of you who are interested in learning more about today's talk and meeting Professor Hein, please remain behind.
Well, thank you. And okage-sama de. It's really thanks to University of Michigan Center for Japanese Studies that I was able to publish this book. So it's a special pleasure to be able to come here and acknowledge that, because it's been a project that I've really enjoyed. I just put this up to give you a sense of the scope of the book as a whole, which I'm only going to be talking really something drawn from my introduction to it, but I didn't write the whole book, and various other people did various other interesting things as part of it as well. Also, this book is, as you will see, the pictures are gorgeous and very colorful. And so at some point I realized that unless I had a huge amount of money, I wouldn't be able to reproduce them in book form very well. And so the academic technologies people at the library at Northwestern University created this really, really great website for me, which is permanent. The URL is in the book. And I really tried to design it so that the two would go together. And here's one that I'm not going to be showing you very much. It turns out this is a real age break. People my age often say to me, it's too bad the pictures are small. And then when I ask the web designers or my kids or any other younger person, they say, well, of course you know you have to click on them. So in case you were wondering, if you click on them, they get bigger. And then they've got some of the metadata there. So that I tried to make it the same quality as Artstor, if you're familiar with that. And just have this that goes with it. So two of the chapters connect Tomiyama's work to others. So this is, as many of you will recognize, the Marukis who did this rendering of what it was like after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. And then the other person is Eleanor Rubin, who's an artist who has some of the same themes as mine. And I don't have a chance to talk about her work much at all, but some of the same themes as Tomiyama, I'm sorry. And since I don't have time to talk, I did bring her book, which this is my copy, so please give it back to me. But I thought I would just send that around. And you may know Joanne Leonard, who's Eleanor's twin sister and also an artist. So that's another connection to here as well. So this is, you can get into this from my web page on my university. If you go to the history department, Northwestern, Laura Hein, you can look at it at your leisure. But that's a piece of this. Okay, now I have to figure out how to get back to the PowerPoint. Thank you. Okay, all right, and that is Tomiyama. One of the most exciting areas of history scholarship right now is the rich vein opened up by the insight of post-colonial studies, particularly recognition of the centrality of colonies to metropolitan life. we now see far more clearly that there really was no modern England without India, France without Senegal, or Japan without Korea and Manchu Quo. Meanwhile, the international context, particularly of competition among the imperial powers, profoundly affected what was once thought of as purely domestic behavior and policies in a variety of ways. I think this insight's been particularly important for Japan's studies because defeat in World War II, followed by partition of the globe along Cold War lines, not only meant that Japan was stripped of its colonies by the stroke of a pen in September 1945, but also that the Japanese had very little interaction with much of the former empire for the subsequent 50 years. So it was an unusually short decolonization process, and one that was quickly subsumed into the general experience of defeat. And the United States, when it made Japan the centerpiece of its Asian Cold War strategy, really cemented that, forbidding Japan from interacting with China, North Korea, and North Vietnam, but also reorganizing the region to integrate it militarily and support economic growth. So, for example, if a Southeast Asian country wanted to get a loan from the United States for a dam or for ports facilities in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, they had to buy cement and engineering expertise from Japan. Really putting Japan in a position, to put it very crudely, going directly from thinking of themselves as the rightful leaders of Asia to thinking of themselves as disconnected from Asia, except in ways mediated by the United States, until after 1989, with the collapse of the Soviet bloc and the death of Emperor Hirohito. There's quite a lot at stake, particularly as American power diminishes globally and Chinese power increases. And as Gavin McCormick has argued, to the dismay of many other Japanese, in the 21st century, political leaders responded by accepting ever deeper level of dependence on the United States, while simultaneously generating a compensatory sullen nationalism. In other words, government rhetoric, just as in the 1930s, has been increasingly pan-Asianist and belligerently nationalist, while, unlike the 1930s, foreign policy is still primarily about retaining the U.S.-Japan alliance. This is not a sustainable combination, as I think recent political developments have shown, although nothing new has really emerged. But for me, my purpose is here. I think the key point is that in the case of Japan, the issues of political autonomy and cultural authenticity, central to all former colonies, are just as tricky a minefield for the metropole. Japan's post-imperial identity has been inextricably braided to its post-war status as favored client in the American-dominated world order on the one hand, and to the project of sidestepping memories of the pre-surrender empire on the other. And that means resurrecting the memory of the colonial past is profoundly disruptive. Moreover, remembering colonial subjects, that is, a legal category of second-class citizens, necessarily also highlights the relationship between citizens and state and the legitimacy of dissent both before and after 1945. When national cultural authenticity is perceived to be at stake, all aspects of culture are political, as Harry Haratunian has been arguing for pre-war Japan for many years now. And more precisely, under such conditions, artists and other producers of culture who wish to distance themselves from the policies of the Japanese government face a particularly difficult challenge. To put the same point another way, while all nationalisms work to delegitimize critics, criticisms gets harder the more that cultural authenticity seems to be at stake. It's therefore noteworthy when someone is able to articulate an alternative vision that delivers precise criticism of Japan's modern history within a larger critique of global trends, all in a distinctively Japanese voice. And Tomiyama Taeko, who is almost 90, is somebody who I think has been able to do that. And she's found several imaginative strategies to help her avoid the pitfalls that endangers work in this terrain of modern historical remembrance. And I'm really interested in why it was so difficult for her to figure out how to say what she wanted to say, and how she was able to move beyond critique of what's wrong to a richly suggestive visual narrative of the crucial features of a better world. As I see it, her work mobilizes a counterpublic in Michael Warner's sense of the term. And this is something that is explicit. She's a very political person, somebody who's been active in social justice movements since the early post-war years. For her, political community and creative practice are mutually constitutive and continually interactive. In an older idiom, one that would make perfect sense to her, these are a dialectical relationship. Long ago, she decided to use her artistic abilities to speak for people who had little opportunity to speak for themselves. And I think it's also fair to say that Tomiyama's long-term efforts, and those of other Japanese like her, contributed to bringing the subject of Japanese responsibility for war and empire to the forefront of debate after 1989. So how did she get there? In the early 1950s, she chose to focus on the plight of Japan's coal miners, who faced some of the worst working conditions in the nation, despite being crucial to post-war economic recovery. At that time, she painted mine landscapes rather than their inhabitants, already making the visual argument that finding beauty in scenery not generally deemed beautiful was a way to find value in people not usually treated as valuable. And this is actually a photograph of one of her early 1950s paintings, because none of them exist anymore. So it wasn't black and white, it was sort of brown. Later work focused on Japanese brutality in Manchuria, post-war repression in South Korea, the complicated emotional and social legacies of war and empire for Japan, and the way that contemporary societies cruelly use and discard some women without any acknowledgement of, let alone opportunity to pursue their own hopes and dreams. And Tomiyama is particularly interested in exploring the complex ways that people can simultaneously be victims and perpetrators, sometimes with the same act. Perhaps Tomiyama's greatest accomplishment is her honesty with herself about such issues. The recent international memoir boom and vast wave of books on historical remembrance has centered on victims' testimony to the trauma that marked their own lives. Trauma is recognizable because individuals create a self-protective shield walling off the memory of the traumatic experience. As Kathy Kareth and others have argued, this process creates a fundamental dislocation of both chronology and memory, further contributing to ongoing silence about the original event. Yet, the effect of such analysis is to further separate victims from everyone else and move their experience out of any kind of social or political debate. And I think what Tomiyama is doing is really challenging this line of thought by focusing on the fact that remembrance is also extremely difficult for perpetrators, for bystanders, and for people who are unsure where they stand. And she is, I think, really expressing her lived experience that war both blinds individuals to their own ethical responsibility and encourages governments to become more oppressive. So she focuses on trauma, on remembrance, not as trauma, but through insistence that her viewers think hard about where they draw the lines around their own identities and through empathy. And she does so in a way that is specifically about 20th century Japan, and simultaneously about the way power works everywhere. So how did Tomiyama arrive at the subject of responsibility for war and empire, which she only began doing in the 1980s? This is a woman born in 1921. Three linked life experiences were crucial. First, from 1961, Tomiyama established connections with labor union, peace, and social justice advocates in other parts of the world. Such transnational contacts have consistently sparked Tomiyama's creative breakthroughs over the years, revealing the extent to which her creativity relies on escaping the confines of nationalism. Second, Tomiyama's thinking evolved considerably when she encountered feminism in the early 1970s. Experience that changed her life. And there's a really great essay by Rebecca Copeland in the book about this particular aspect of Tomiyama's life, and she really convincingly argues that feminism gave Tomiyama not only a new way to see, but also to speak. And then third, it also, the feminist insight that the personal is political, showed Tomiyama how to incorporate her youth in Manchuria into her art. She grew up there. Her father was a businessman there. Manchuria was then one of the most transnational spaces in the Japanese Empire, which, as President Dwyer argues, makes it a particularly useful place for understanding the ways that localities simultaneously serve to support and undermine the legitimacy of the state, an insight that Tomiyama herself explores in her art. This particular painting is called The Foundation of Manchu Quo, and it's got all sorts of imperial symbols in it. Tomiyama moved to Tokyo in 1938 to study painting and printmaking at the Women's Academy of Fine Arts, where she felt neither fully an insider nor an outsider. And some of her frustration was due to the alienation of a colonial settler in the metropole, something that people just stopped talking about after the war, and Tomiyama was one of them. This is a really common experience for former settlers, both in Japan, as Laurie Watt and Mariko Tamanai have shown, and elsewhere. And Tomiyama didn't really bring these life experiences into her art or into contemporary Japanese consciousness until the 1980s, when her art production became more prolific, more profound, and more influential. First, she had other problems she needed to solve. At the start of her career, Tomiyama really struggled with how to situate her art within established canons, particularly in relation to Europe. Like many other students of her era, she was an avid consumer of European culture, such as the work of symbolist, novelist, playwright, and ardent pacifist Romain Rolland, and printmaker Käthe Kollwitz. And this is her juxtaposition of her own print with a Kollwitz piece on the right. She was strongly attracted to the more intellectually free environment that she imagined existed in Europe, even though by 1938 this image was far less accurate than it had been a few years earlier. Tomiyama was caught in the dilemma common to denizens of all non-Western modern societies, not just formal colonies, which had to cope with the flood of European claims to civilizational superiority that accompanied their imperialist projects. And of course, as this audience knows, Japanese leaders of previous decades had responded by adopting the same formula of colonizing and making war on others. But that strategy impressed the world. However, it simultaneously deepened the belief that Japanese copied well but had little in the way of independent modern culture. And the price of joining the imperialist club seemed to many Japanese to be, for Japan alone, spiritual and cultural suicide and anxiety that drove them to seek cultural renovation through war. And as we also know, the national government mobilized most of Japan's leading artists into the war effort and politicized both painting and printmaking as national projects, meaning that Tomiyama's forays into both forms necessarily required taking a stand on the Japaneseness of her work, which was for her a stifling demand. One of the things I really like about doing history is there's stuff that's better than anything you could make up. So in an irony worthy of fiction, she emerged on December 8th, 1941, from a screening of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington to discover that Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor and declared war on the United States. So you can, I think, the whole room full of people must have appreciated the irony there. Yet Tomiyama could see no way of rejecting nationalism without copying European art and then being pigeonholed as the Japanese Kollwitz, a problem that diminished but did not disappear after 1945. And in fact, Tomiyama felt this dilemma so keenly that for 20 years she didn't paint at all, although she continued to make prints. How she eventually resolved this, I'm going to tell you a little out of chronology so that I can show you more images. One solution was to explore the metaphor of traffic between the worlds of humans and spirits to comment on relations of power within human society, her true subject. And the first way she did this was by focusing on the shaman, an often female figure from folklore who commands powers that are not unambiguously either good or evil. The shaman is Pan-Asian rather than Japanese or Western, and unlike other folkloric figures, such as Momotaro the Peach Boy, was never featured in either imperialist or Japanese nationalist pageantry. This is from an art exhibit of 1911. In other words, the shaman allowed her to imagine a world characterized by female power and an Asian identity that Japan shares but does not dominate. It also highlights the complex nature of morality and the existence of a world beyond ours where earthly power and prestige mean very little. Tomiyama arrived at this strategy by a geographically roundabout route. In 1961, frustrated by the turn to abstraction in post-war art and the lack of models other than European ones, she decided to travel abroad. Deliberately avoiding Europe, she spent a year mainly in Latin America, but also South Africa, supporting herself by publishing illustrated essays. Later, she visited Central Asia, Southeast Asia, China, and South Korea. These journeys changed the way she saw her own art. First of all, they brought home to Tomiyama the extent to which European culture had been built on the exploitation of Americans, Africans, and Asians, and the extent to which European artistic movements had appropriated, say, African art in a setting that robbed Africans of subjectivity and recognized as art only the work of white people. And so now she saw Japan's relationship to its colonies as part of a global pattern replicated in other empires. Politically, she began working with the Korean democracy movement, producing lithographs on Korean prisoners of conscience, including one that Amnesty International used for a greeting card. And the plight of Korean political prisoners focused Tomiyama's attention on Japan's responsibilities for the post-war repressiveness of its former colony, because at that time the South Korean government was still filled with men who had collaborated with the Japanese imperialist government before 1945. After the war, they maintained power only through the military support of the United States. And the cost to human rights was very high. Kim Chi-ha was the most famous of the regime's many political prisoners, but not the only ones. And so this is another of her lithographs from that era. By the mid-1970s, Tomiyama also felt that she had developed an Asian visual language and so could paint again in ways that did not feel to her to be derivative. And so some of her Central Asian imagery, this is one, and this is one of my favorite ones. And if you look at from Iran or that part of the world, it's quite familiar. Her treatment of the shaman is an example of this visual language, but she has other important strategies too. One is to mix paintings, prints, and collages, which she arranges into narratives, an idea that came from Japanese emaki picture scrolls of the medieval period. A third is to combine various religious and folklore traditions from across Asia through the metaphor of transnational travel. Her most recently completed series is on the journey of a variety of Asian puppets from Central Asia to the Chinese coast onto Awaji Island in Japan, which is both the childhood home of her parents and has a distinguished history of political liberalism, then to the waters off Southeast Asia and New Guinea. Japan is a stop along the way, but neither the cultural origin point nor the culmination of the journey. The travelers include Malaysian and Indonesian puppets, Polynesian masks, and Japanese folk figures such as Ebisu, and I'm going to show you more from this section at the end, from this series. Tomiyama calls these puppets troubadours, or tabigenin, to evoke the medieval wandering artists who carried culture with them, mingling ideas without regard to national borders. Such individuals were themselves of very low status, and both they and their artistry were routinely undervalued by powerful people, underscoring Tomiyama's signature argument that revaluing one requires revaluing another. Tomiyama typically combines a variety of inspirations in one piece in a highly imaginative and personal way. And I wanted to give you one extended example of it. This is the first painting she did after 20 years in the early 1980s, which was it's called Those Who Fly in the Sky. She painted this after looking at an important funerary banner from an ancient Chinese tomb that was discovered at Mawangdui in the 1970s. And she retained the color palette and much of the imagery, such as the bird in the moon, if you look at that up there. The original silk banner shows the travel of souls after death to the realm of the immortals, including the mythical founder of China, King Fuji, on a chariot pulled by dragons. And when Tomiyama looked at the banner, she thought, why is the king in the chariot? A woman giving birth is far more important. And so she repainted it. And she retained the existing imagery, such as the bird and the moon. And, of course, the dragon is like the shaman, a symbol that has symbolic resonances both inside and outside Japan. But she also added her own meanings, drawn from ancient and modern themes, real and mythic individuals, and European, Asian, and Latin American sources in a highly personal manner. The painting is crammed with these symbols. So the dragons represent the education mama urging her child to claw his way up the status ladder in Japan today. Well, down in the corner, this guy here, is Brazilian educator Paulo Freire. Tomiyama is mocking the cult of meritocracy through educational achievement and the way it organizes social ambition in post-war Japan. Meanwhile, the tiger in the lower right is from the book of Isaiah, when the lion lay down with the lamb and enemies are reconciled, although the African lion has been replaced by the Asian tiger. Animals, humans, and gods all pursue their own activities, while the central figure brings a new person into the world. The paintings are maps of her mind, revealing the lively and imaginative way that she combines images and concepts. Her political point, being made in several different ways at once, is that everyone borrows images and symbols all the time. Her work is deeply authentic precisely because it openly acknowledges her diverse sources of inspiration. I think one of the reasons that this works so well for her is she treats Japanese tradition in exactly the same way as the cultural traditions of other locations, also making it clear that places like pre-war Manchuria can't really be thought of as wholly Japanese or wholly foreign. Just a quick example, 1988 silkscreen of Japanese women sent early in the 20th century to earn foreign exchange for Japan in the brothels of Asia. The Karayuki-san, of course, draws on the long tradition of painting women, the demi-monde. But she also connects different sets of things. So Harbin and the Fox Story series, you see this the most. They both have these classic, elegant symbols of Japanese aesthetics, such as the chrysanthemum and the cherry blossom. And of course, both of these flowers acquired modern significance as symbols central to the aesthetics of Japanese fascism in the 1930s. The golden 18-petal chrysanthemum, which you can see here and shows up in Tomiyama's work quite a lot, is the symbol of the emperor. And the consul general who lives in Chicago, he's got it over the front door of his house. The cherry blossom was appropriated by the military during World War II as the emblem of the young kamikaze's noble sacrifice, self-sacrifice, because the cherry is most beautiful while the petals fall from the tree, and its season is so short. Both military officers and the families of dead pilots referred to them as having become cherry blossoms at Kudanshita, that is, spirits enshrined at Yasukuni Shrine. Tomiyama combines these highly aestheticized national symbols with others from an equally venerable but much earthier folk tradition, the fox. As in Europe, the East Asian fox is a trickster character, able to shapeshift and bewitch humans. The fox is also the guardian of the Shinto rice god and is therefore very close to the emperor, who is the high priest of Shintoism and ritually responsible for the annual rice harvest. I was startled to discover from Yuki Miyamoto's essay for this book that this icon of Shinto belief actually comes from Chinese folk traditions, although acknowledgement of that ancient cultural appropriation and Japanese oblivious to it today underscores Tomiyama's central point. In both the Harbin, and this is from the Fox Story, Tomiyama painted the Japanese of the 1930s as bewitched into hastily marrying off their sons and then sending them to die young, while doing everything possible to turn their daughters into impoverished single mothers. She uses the theme of bewitchment to subvert the traditional associations of the cherry blossom, which in her hands represents the callousness and deviousness of the Japanese state towards the lives of both its colonial and Japanese victims. So how did she get here? Tomiyama is borrowing from the long, irreverent tradition of satirical animal imagery in Japanese art, much of it explicitly celebrating political dissent. Obviously, this is the 12th century scroll that everybody starts with when they talk about historical origins of manga. But I'm also thinking of this political cartoon from 1860 when the Tokugawa shogun's son was married off to an imperial princess to to create an alliance that didn't actually work. And if you look at the center, they're fairly human, but if you look off to the edges, they get foxier and foxier as they go. So this was meant to be a political satire from that period. Also from the same period, Kawanabe Kyosai, with his never particularly nice dancing animals here. And in such a presentation, any assertion of a single Japanese aesthetic just seems absurd. In Tomiyama's most famous narrative series, Memories of the Sea, she brought together feminism with these resources to comment on the cruelty of imperialism and war and the hypocrisy of post-war Japanese society. And she decided to paint a series on the Korean women who had been conscripted to provide sex to Japanese soldiers during World War II. This is something that was not unknown, but at that point, people didn't talk about it, and she really set out to break this taboo. The first former comfort woman to speak out publicly, King Ha-sun, did not do so until 1991, 4 years after Tomiyama painted this series. And this is also really where she got known overseas. In fact, this image, this is a big painting, and it's got a companion that I'll show you in a minute, was first shown at the University of London in 1988, and only after that in either Japan or Korea. And beginning with this series, Tomi also started creating sets of collages on the same theme that could travel inexpensively to student galleries or spaces based on political affinity rather than those designed to display large, expensive, and easily damaged artwork. I'll come back to this, but then the next series she did after that was on Southeast Asian women who were trafficked to Japan as sex workers in the 1990s when she was painting this. One series called the Thai Girl Who Never Came Home, and another one called Working in Kabukicho, which is this one, which explicitly connects the wartime sex slaves to contemporary imprisonment of Asian women in Japan through prostitution and debt peonages. The large and red and blue paintings of Memory of the Sea are set on the ocean floor of Southeast Asia. And she really imagines a haunted and beautiful sea as the final resting place for these young girls who had enjoyed so little beauty in their lives. She refigured Balinese Hindu tradition for this work, imagining there's the festival of Galangan, that's Galangan, imagining the girls as spirits who return from the dead at the festival of Galangan. It's a lot like Obon. And there he is in the center top there. He's a protective deity. This is also where she started using the many Southeast Asian masks and puppets that she had collected on her travels that later took center stage in the Puppets Journey green project that I showed you one of before. As Lisa Saltzman has argued, in the context of mourning, masks evoke remembrance by reminding viewers of people whose deaths are never spoken of and so challenge them to bear witness. Tomiyama is also ripping the mask off the popular 1930s idea that the war would sweep clean the impurity of modern Western-influenced life, that is, the promise of cultural renovation at the heart of fascism. She lays bare the folly of that expectation by focusing on the unresolved, painful, shameful, and ambivalent problems left behind in the wake of war and imperial excess. Her art directly speaks to broken bodies and bereft families. And in that respect, she is indeed much like the German interwar printmakers, Otto Dix and Käthe Kollwitz, both of whom she admires. This is the other memory of the sea painting. As with the painting of the woman giving birth, the cheery skulls and skeletons in Memories of the Sea are reminiscent of both Japanese and non-Japanese cultural traditions. They draw from such sources as the medieval scroll depicting the land of the hungry ghosts, this one, and Kawanabe Kyosai, the 19th century satirical artist whose dancing animals I showed you before. His specialty was cavorting skeletons. His claim to fame was that he could get really drunk and paint 100 of them in a minute. So he had a lot of practice doing this. At the same time, these paintings also bow to Mexican Day of the Dead imagery, particularly the work of artist Jose Posada. By the 1980s, in contrast to her younger self, Tomiyama really felt free to openly appropriate imagery from European paintings as well, despite her desire to free her art from the European canon as a canon, just as she borrows ideas from the Book of Isaiah. So Hieronymus Bosch, the early 16th century Netherlandish painter, is an important influence, and this, of course, comes from this part of this painting. Her collages take this practice of sampling even farther than do the paintings. Tomiyama now uses a computer to digitize and reproduce details from her paintings, which she reuses in different ways, including design elements in the collages. And she first started doing this in order to be able to circulate her work to a broader audience, but then it influenced her painting technique. Her paintings got more crammed with detail because she knows that it will be deconstructed later on. And she started using the internet to find, for example, a painting of An Chang-an, who is a photograph of him, who's the Korean patriot who famously assassinated Ito Hirobumi, and which she incorporated into a collage depicting Harbin Station, the scene of Ito's death. Not only does Tomiyama comment directly on the multicultural architectural and artistic heritage of Manchu Quo and the moral self-deceptions worked there through her choice of subjects, but she also acknowledges the pastiche of cultural mixing through her collage techniques. Plus, she started doing this in her 70s and her 80s, and I find her willingness to experiment with new media very impressive. I wanted to end by talking about another aspect of her artistic practice, which is that she has a very close relationship with several other creative artists, particularly contemporary music composer Takahashi Yuji. Tomiyama and Takahashi's connection is both artistic and political. They first met in the 1970s as activists in the international movement to support the Korean poet Kim Chi-ha, and have now produced 5 first slide and music, now DVD presentations together. Takahashi composes for computers as well as traditional instruments, and his pieces harmonize with photos of fragments of Tomiyama's works, combining into a powerful multimedia performance art. And I just wanted to show you one more painting before I do this. So this is from the 2009 series of The Puppet's Journey, and this is the last image in that series, which is an undersea version of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, burning in an underwater hell and somehow destroying the atmosphere while providing the pretext for another war. Tomiyama has returned to the theme of Japanese subservience to American military policy in Asia, defining the present as another moment of massive and all too willing bewitchment. She's connecting the puppet's travel to earlier eras of European and Japanese imperialism, and challenging her viewers to think harder about the human environmental costs of empire. And, of course, challenging the rest of us, not just Japanese, to examine our own willingness to be deceived. Okay, and so now I just give you about 5 minutes of one of these DVD joint compositions of theirs. those guys. You can dress them up, but they're still demons. That would be Emperor Hirohito. So that's a good place to start. So she slipped him in there just for her own personal pleasure. It doesn't say so anywhere, though.